Our world is changing. Everything and everyone around us is changing every day. And so is our climate. Only that our climate is making much more drastic changes. Climate change means that temperature and typical weather patterns are shifting. It also means that these weather patterns are getting less predictable. Unexpected, yes, even uncontrollable weather events like rising sea levels increase the risk of intense flooding, which drives people from their homes and separate families. Hurricanes, wildfires, and droughts make it very difficult to maintain and grow crops in regions that rely on farming, threatening their food production. If I could guess, this is nothing new to you. We are all familiar with the pictures and the videos in the news of burning forests and destroyed villages. And if I could take another guess, I would say that most likely you haven't experienced one of these events yourself. I would like to take you on a journey in which I share insights and knowledge I was able to gain in the past months. Will you join me?
The climate crisis affects us all, but a huge amount of people in our world are affected stronger and earlier than others, especially communities of color, indigenous communities, and people living in the global south. Being exposed to extreme heat or air pollution causes severe health illnesses or can lead to death. These disasters result in over 60,000 deaths every year, and yes, these events mostly happen in developing countries, but are also closer to us than we might think. People living in polluted areas in cities like London or even in the Netherlands are faced with the dangers of our changing climate. This is happening right now. We're speaking here of a structural problem. The people most affected by climate change are affected by multiple systems of oppressions. Not only are they suffering from the effects of changing climate, but of the inequalities and imbalances formed by a long history of exploiting humans and nature. It is our role to recognize these imbalances and include them into our environmentalism, which advocates for both the protection of the people and the planet.
As I already explained in my speech at the Climate Alarm in Breda, fighting to save our planet also means fighting for the people who are affected by those systems of oppressions. But what does this all mean? Throughout my research, I was able to realize that the impacts of climate change are not borne equally by all populations. Wealthier people and countries have the means to protect themselves from the drastic changes our climate is making. Higher incomes pay for better housing and better areas and fill their shopping carts. The most vulnerable people in our world are living in the poorest countries, but also are living in the most polluted areas of our world cities. Because of long-lasting problems and issues that we have in our societal system, people of color are the ones most affected by the effects of climate change. This incident can also be described as being intersectional, which means that multiple systems of oppressions are coming together. People of color are experiencing injustices based on racism and are being discriminated because they are the most to experience those climate crisis effects. Ironically, the Black, Indigenous, people of color community are the least to contribute to the climate crisis, but are the ones to experience the climate crisis the most. The people who are contributing to the climate crisis are not the ones who are experiencing its effects. One thing that is so frustrating about this is that people of color who are under these conditions are not able to escape their situation. As David Lammy is saying in his TED Talk about climate justice, global warming isn't your concern when you can't pay the heating bills, and you don't think about pollution when you're being stopped by the police. I hope I was already able to make clear how the climate crisis and social and racial justice are connected with each other, and how interconnected these two issues are. To understand how deeply rooted the system issue is, we're going to take a couple steps back and go to one of the starting points of our current inequalities and imbalances of our society. In the 15th century, Christopher Columbus set sail to discover the unknown. When landing in Cuba, he wrote in his journal how nice the local people were to him and how free they were with their possessions, taking him into their homes. He also described how equal the people were. Even women were allowed to leave their partners when they felt that they were being mistreated. He described them as peaceful. And while this sounds like a rather wonderful journal entry, he also wrote in his journal, "With 50 men, we can subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." On his next trip to Cuba, Christopher Columbus took 17 ships with him and 1,200 men. After his returning, there was certainly no peace to be found. And while indigenous people and local inhabitants of the colonies were forced to bring gold, silver, and goods to the colonizers, Europe financed themselves, their military, and jump-started themselves into wealth. Once the slave trade began, 12 to 15 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic. As Jason Hickel is stating in his book, The Divide, it is estimated that the US profited alone of 222,505,049 hours of forced labor between the years of 1619 and 1865. What I want to point out is that without the massive infusion of labor and ecological windfall of the slave colonies, neither the US or Europe would have been able to develop themselves the way they did. It is impossible to examine the economic growth of the West without understanding where it came from. My understanding of this whole history got to another level once I was able to realize that the story of inequality and poverty is a creation story and not just something that exists. We need to understand that Europe didn't develop the colonies developed Europe. Coming back from this trip to the past, I had to realize that things aren't very much different today than they were all those years ago. The so-called developing countries of today are still being oppressed by the Western world, and these countries are not able to make the development that Europe was able to make back then. And on top of that, the same countries have to deal with the challenges and the damages of the climate crisis today. Also, colonialism and slavery overused and exhausted the land of the earth, especially in the global south, being exploited by its people and by its nature to the advantage of the global north. It is suffering. Today, companies and countries are fueling into this environmental racism and neocolonialism that I just described, making sure that Black, Indigenous, people of color communities are continuously being held at the bottom of society. Next to that, these same companies and countries are contributing to the climate crisis, which makes the climatic conditions in the global south even worse. You could even say that the climate crisis is, in a way, colonialism's natural conclusion. And that is the reason why we need to include racial justice and the history of colonialism into our environmentalism. We need to protect our planet, but primarily care for the people who are living on it. We need to give BIPOC communities their voices back and listen to the people who are actually affected by the climate crisis and not to the ones who are causing it. I would like to challenge you to think along about your own involvement with this issue. Can you imagine a world in which justice is at the forefront? How would that look like? What would you need to change in order for this to happen? Where do you still profit from the climate crisis and the systems of oppression? Or maybe can you think of bigger players who should give certain things up or change their structure for climate justice and overall equality? What are skills or qualities of yours to help and fight for climate justice? And where do you think you need to lean back and listen a bit more to other people and their stories? Where do we still need to educate ourselves on in order to grow and learn?
We're here today because we know that a climate-just world is possible and that together we can achieve a system change. And because we know that this is possible, we will not let go or stop fighting. Let's go.
Okay, thank you, Annalena. And I think Arnold has also flowers